All right. Well, good evening and welcome to week 4 of our presentation series. Tonight's topic is soil preparation. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you have been enjoying the session so far. If you're here for the first time, we hope that you enjoy this one. In particular, there's still a lot of really great information to come. So I just want to mention, as we were talking about briefly before the recording, that the sessions are now loaded onto the websites along with the presentation materials, and those can be found at the Los Alamos County DPU Conserve and Reduce website, and also the Los Alamos Extension website. And we will keep those up to date as we move through the weeks to come. And I think I've asked everybody to sign in. If you're just walking in, please do so, or you can always sign in on the way out. Those joining us on Zoom, can everyone hear me okay? And if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat and we'll address each of them at the end of the presentation. I'm Angela Prado. I'm the Ag and 4-H agent here in Los Alamos County, and I'm excited to talk about soils tonight. So tonight we'll focus on 5 key areas, and these include first, the soil conditions, considering what you may have to work with. We will cover the importance of soil health, and then we'll go a little deeper and talk about soil characteristics. And finally, we'll talk about soil care and some next steps to consider as you begin to prepare your site. So we'll start off with just a couple photos here of some common landscapes we see around town, just to get the conversation started. And again, feel free, those in person, to interrupt me along the way. If something pops into your head, we can talk about it. The photo on the left, to me, is just nice and clean, somewhat inexpensive, and relatively easy to maintain. Is it attractive? Some might say yes, others might say no. It's all kind of relative to our personal preferences. The photo on the right is essentially the same, but this is what things look like without any maintenance in place, even with the best weed barriers. So again, just a couple more photos here we commonly see. I know these kind of represent what my house looked like when I moved in about 12 years ago. And there were lots of rock and gravel just kind of haphazardly placed, and lots of weeds coming up. So I knew I had my work cut out for me. So my question was, what do I do? How do I get started? I'll be honest, this is more my style. Truthfully, I had hoped to achieve this in my yard, and so it's a work in progress. We'll get there eventually. I'd like to claim this, but it's not mine. So the first thing I did was march right over to what is now Petrie Gardens. Back then it was located in Pajarito Acres in White Rock. And so I bought myself some nice new fancy plants, went home and put them in the ground. In the meantime, friends and neighbors were giving me all kinds of random perennials and shrubs and stuff that they had dug out of their yard that they would ordinarily have thrown out. So they knew I was kind of new in town and needed some help, and passed those along, which I was truly grateful. But the problem was I wasn't ready. I hadn't prepared a site. I hadn't even figured out where things might go. I hadn't considered, sun and shade, microclimates. I hadn't built any beds, hadn't done anything to my soil whatsoever. And I certainly hadn't done a site plan, for that matter. So needless to say, I stuck those plants in the ground and hoped for the best, meanwhile dragging my hose all around the yard to try to water diligently. Now, if you look closely at these photos, you'll notice these are plants that are quite popular in our landscape. I see some sage and some yarrow, also see some lavender, maybe some Jupiter's beard there in the pink, and some other common perennials in the background. We have these all over town. We see them in the demonstration garden, we see them in our streetscapes. Even if we venture off the hill, we see them in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, all around our surrounding areas as well. And that's because a lot of folks like these. They provide a good mix of color, texture, and variety, and you can buy them at most any local nurseries or big box stores. And if you're lucky like me, your neighbors and friends will give them to you for free. But what I like about these photos is that I can see some gravel and some wood laid around these plants, and also underneath as well. And I would even say that these plants are probably well irrigated. So these are all some common things that we start to think about when we think about soils. So let's think about for a second what might be going on in these soils compared to the previous slide. And actually, there are some really good things in both, if we think about it. You could argue the soil in this slide is probably a little bit better just because it's got some coverage and it's got likely some water. But in the previous slide, we do have gravel, so that's a mulch. And we also have some, hopefully some precipitation, which is a form of irrigation. So both are benefiting the soil, and we'll get into a little bit more about mulch as we go through the presentation tonight. So the question is, how do we get from here or here to here? And that's why we're here tonight. You guessed it, it's the soil. So let's talk about soil health. It is the capacity to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service. Healthy soils give us many things, including clean air and water, bountiful crops and forests, productive grazing lands, diverse wildlife, and beautiful landscapes. And this is accomplished through 5 essential functions. Healthy soil can first and foremost determine how water from rain, snowmelt, and irrigation flows on the land and how it affects both erosion and infiltration. It can filter, buffer, immobilize, and detoxify potential pollutants from industrial, municipal, and atmospheric sources. The minerals and microbes in the soil are responsible for these processes. Number 3, healthy soil can cycle nutrients such as carbon, phosphorus, and potassium from the atmosphere to the earth and then back into the air through various chemical processes. Healthy soil can also provide stability for support for plants and root structures. And finally, healthy soil supports building and roadways for human use and protection for archaeologic materials. So lots of good stuff there. And so we ask, why is soil health so important? Because it is the responsibility of every human to nurture the land to sustain its productivity. To be good stewards of the environment is vital to our existence. And from an urban horticulture perspective, we have to keep in mind that our plants are only as good as the soil we plant them in. This is a quote from Marisa Thompson, our urban horticulture specialist at NMSU. She is an avid plant enthusiast. If you've never met her and get the opportunity, I highly recommend. I also recommend, if you're ever surfing the web and you want some good information, check out her website at NMSU Desert Blooms. She's got all the latest publications as well as a blog where she handles questions and discussions. And those are posted there for reference. So really great resource there. Now let's talk about your soil. Hopefully by now you've start to think about how you might outline your intended use for your space, and you've decided where some plants might be going. And you might be wondering at this point, how healthy is my soil? Is it ready for planting? What should I do before I plant? These are all good questions. So it's recommended that you start with a soil test. And I get calls quite often all throughout the year. How do I get my soil tested? So this is a conversation I have quite frequently. And we don't have a soil lab here in New Mexico. So we recommend using one of our neighbor states, either Colorado State University or Texas A&M, just because they're a little closer and it's probably less in shipping. Any lab across the state will do the job, but these are a little closer and we'll have a little more of a reasonable response time. So you can find these by doing just a simple search in your browser for Colorado State University soil test. Then simply follow the instructions to make your request, fill out the form, collect your sample, and mail the payment to the address provided. If you choose to use Texas A&M Lab, the process is the same. And their webpage is shown here on the right. Colorado State is here on the left. So that's where you start. A few options once you get into their website and you find the forms and the address and all that good stuff. A few options for selecting which test you want to request. I've included just a few here off the menu to get you started. At the very least, you'll want to know the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and pH of your soil. Those are all basic elements that will help you decide as a grower what to plant and how to amend your soils. And then, of course, how to nurture those plants as you go through. The soil pH is real important because we have alkaline soils in our region. Typically, across the county, we hover right around a 8, give or take. Whether you're in White Rock or Los Alamos, that's kind of an across the board number. And so that's something that we struggle to grow in. So just keep that in mind. And then at the very least, because we have that alkaline pH, you probably will at some point be adding some iron to your plant, so your landscape, and definitely some organic matter. Okay. All right, so basic soil test that's at Colorado State University costs $30. That's the sample in the middle. Just fit there because of the way the boxes fell. But it's in the middle there, and it'll get you everything you need to know. It's got pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, also some soluble salts and sulfur, but most importantly, organic matter. So that's a real comprehensive test for a pretty reasonable price there. The next tier is the complete test, and that gets you all those basic components plus a few extras like let's see, some of the micronutrients, soluble salts, and other chemical values that are a little more specific to large scale farming. Some people really like to get into what's in their soil, and they have more of a science background. And so if you're interested in knowing and you want to get the full complete test, I encourage you to do that. It's good information. But for the basic gardener, basic test should be fine. And then I just included that test on the far right. That's the soil salinity test, and on their menu, it's the third option. So it's got a few various items as well: a pH, potassium, sulfurs, and soluble salts, to name a few. Keep in mind, you'll have to add nitrogen and potassium to that separately, and also organic matter. I don't believe that's on there. So it's all in how you compile your request that's going to tell you the story of your soil, and all very helpful information. It's just a matter of how you make those requests. What I like about Colorado State University is, we've had a history with them being NMSU, and they're kind of our sister state. So we rely a lot on their resources, and so we've used them for a long time. And I know other folks have used other labs. So this is my go-to just because of habit. But like I said, any lab will do the job. But I do like the fact that Colorado State will provide some recommendations for fertilizers and amendments just based on what you're growing. They'll ask you what you're growing, and they'll ask you some specific questions for that. All right, moving on to Texas A&M. The menu there is similar, but it's just broken down a bit differently. So again, here's just the first 5 options that I pulled just for you to see. If you choose the first 3 options on the left and 2 in the middle, then that'll tell you pretty much what you need to know. Again, all those same components as what we talked about just a minute ago. But if you want to know things like organic matter or texture, those might need to be added separately. And actually, those fall into the next 2 categories. And you can see the price difference. These first 3 are fairly inexpensive, even compared to Colorado State University. But the 2 on the right are a little more comprehensive, but also a little more expensive. Good question. So the question is, just for folks on Zoom, is this for a single sample? The answer is yes. So it'd be $30 or whichever test you choose for 1 sample. And it's, depending on what your goals are, you may want to choose 2 or 3 or 4 samples. That does add up as you compile those requests. So just a good question. Thank you. Yes, we have one more question. So I kind of like to think of it as bids, essentially. I know not all yards are set up that way, but if you've got a bed of perennials, and ideally that's kind of where we're going with this series is trying to help people learn to kind of consolidate their plants based on needs, based on, are they edibles, are they perennials, are they shrubs, those kinds of things, and also based on water needs. So to answer that question, I would say 1 per area per bed, so to speak, if that helps. And then aside from that, if you've got, so like for example, you might take a sample from your lawn where you might want to grow some grass, from seed or sod, and then you might want to take a sample from your vegetable bed where you can be growing vegetables. Those are going to be different different soil. The soil makeup might be the same, but they're going to have some different needs as far as soil care. So good question. Yes. Percent base saturation? Good question. Let's see, which one was that? It must have been on Colorado State University. So that's like, if you think of a base saturation, that's a little more scientific in explanation, but you've got acids and bases, in basic chemistry, so to speak. And so your base saturation has to do with your pH and your alkalinity. And that's I have to get you some more detailed information, but that's kind of the general scope of that. Okay. All right, so let's move on and take a little deeper look at some of the characteristics of soil. Soil is made up of three major components. These are physical components, chemical components, and biological components. And soil health is ideally achieved when all three are in balance and working together. It takes a long time to build soil, roughly tens of thousands of years for just a few inches, in fact, and again, depending on the location. Soil formation is dependent on 5 factors. Those are parental material, which is the rocks and minerals that are beneath the ground, climate, living organisms, topography, and time. About 95% of the soil in Los Alamos County comes from the surrounding bandolier tuff, volcanic rock, and basaltic rock in the vicinity. And this image here shows the various layers of earth, just from the bottom parental layer, which is the rock and minerals again, and then the subsoil just above it, and then the topsoil and humus on top, which is where the good stuff happens. Depending on the terrain and where you are, you may have anywhere from 2 to 10 inches of topsoil, but typically the average is about 6 inches in our area. That's good for planting. I know some folks out in Pajarito Acres are a little more rocky, a little less dense with their topsoil, but on the average, it's about 6 inches. So we'll start with our physical characteristics. These are texture, density, porosity, and stability. And we'll talk about each one separately. Soil texture is the proportion of sand, silt, and clay particles in your soil. This is important to know because it will dictate how water moves through your soil. Sandy soils are generally loose, containing large granular particles made of rocks and minerals. Silty soils are a bit more dense, with medium-sized granular sediment and a floury-like consistency. They can hold significant amounts of water. Clay soils are the most dense of the three, with very, very fine granular material that holds water very well and can be problematic because of that. And finally, loam is the ideal soil for plants. It contains equal parts of sand, silt, and clay, and it retains water well. It retains water and nutrients well, but also allows for adequate drainage. And loam can be classified as sandy loam, silty loam, or clay loam, depending on the composition. The triangle here shows the types of soil combinations based on composition. If you know the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in your soil, you can use the diagram here to determine which type of soil you have based on where those percentages intersect inside the triangle. Soils in Los Alamos are typically some variation of sand, silt, and loam, some clay. I know some places are heavy in clay, but typically sand, silt, and loam are what we commonly see in our area. All right, here's a diagram that shows how water moves through soil types, particularly sand and clay. The sandy soil on the left of the screen, with sandy soil here, we can see that the water infiltrates quickly and spans a more narrow plane underground, thus targeting a smaller root zone. Whereas water clay soils, which we see on the right, water in clay soils is bound in a more shallow plane for longer periods. And this can be helpful in determining your irrigation schedule. Here is a simple jar test that you can do at home to determine the texture of your soil. If you don't want to have that sent in with your soil test, it's just quick and easy. Start by filling a clear jar, about halfway full of dirt. Then fill the remaining half with water, leaving about an inch at the top of airspace. Attach the lid, shake it up really well, and make sure you break up all those clumps. And then set it aside overnight, leave it undisturbed, check it out after about 24 hours. And it will settle out with the sand on the bottom, then the silt layer in the middle, and the clay layer on top. Then, of course, the water at the very top, and then a little bit of air that you left in. This will give you a rough estimate of the percentage of each in your soil. And again, this is just helpful in determining your basic soil type. Another test you can do at home is the percolation test. It doesn't tell you percentage of type of soil or anything like that, but it will tell you how your soil drains, which can be helpful in your irrigation plan. Start by digging a hole about the size of a 5-gallon bucket, fill it up with water, and wait for 4 hours. Then refill the hole again with water and place a yardstick straight up and down to check the initial depth of the water. And at that point, you want to begin to record how long it takes for that water to drop 2 inches. Ideally, you want to see a percolation rate between 1 and 3 inches per hour, which is adequate for most plants. But if it is less than 1 inch per hour, you should add some soil amendments and add some soil amendments and water less frequently for a longer duration. If your percolation rate is greater than 4 inches per hour, you should add some amendments and water more frequently for shorter periods. And finally, if it falls between 1 and 3 inches, you should say hooray. And you should still add some soil amendments because they're good for the soil periodically. And adjust your irrigation to meet the plant's needs. All right, moving on to soil density. This is a little more of a deeper look into the soil. This is the arrangement of soil particles like sand, silt, and clay into aggregates. And aggregates are really important because they form the functional units of the soil. They're the stuff that help hold it together and allow it to do its job. And aggregates are important because they really affect the permeability. Here we have 6 basic types of soil arrangements or aggregates. First 2 on the left are granular and aggregated and are both highly permeable and desirable. The soil will hold together to form channels for air and water to move freely. The 2 in the middle are blocky and columnar arrangements. And these are a little more dense with a moderate permeability. Water and air can still move in these spaces, but there's a little less open space available. And finally, on the right, the platy and massive soil compositions have almost no channels, have very low permeability. These arrangements are often associated with compacted soils. Soil porosity goes hand in hand with soil density. As we saw on the previous slide, the arrangement of soil aggregates creates space for water and air to move. Soil moisture refers to the water holding capacity in the pores between those particles. The soil must be able to take up enough water and circulate it efficiently to make it available for the plants. The image on the right here shows the varying degrees of soil saturation. And here we can see there's an optimum window before a healthy water capacity reaches the point of supersaturation on the far right, or the opposite direction on the left. Oops, excuse me, I have that backwards. Soil saturation on the far left, and then the wilting point on the far right. And again, the way the soils hold water has to do with those aggregates and the materials that are in the soil to make up those aggregates. So achieving soil porosity definitely requires an understanding of some of the physical characteristics of your soil, and it's essential for gardening success. Soil aeration is also affected by soil porosity, and it's the exchange of air between the dirt and the environment. We often don't think about that. You know, the air we breathe is cycling down into the dirt and back up, and that's kind of a cool phenomenon. Healthy soils require the same amount of oxygen that you and I are breathing, which is about 21%. Poorly aerated soils will contain low oxygen and high amounts of carbon dioxide, which can be detrimental to the environment. All right, here's another slide on soil consistency that shows how soils hold together and resist deformation when water is added. Again, this has to do with the arrangement and size of soil particles. And a great tool just that you can do at home, what you do is you just add a little bit of soil to the palm of your hand, about kind of like the center of your palm, maybe the size of a quarter, $half. And then you trickle a small amount. I like to use a little squirt bottle that'll just moisten that soil, and you just kind of work it in a circle and see what it does. The image on the left is what'll happen, shows what'll happen if you have a sandy soil. It's going to kind of get cakey and not hold together very well. The image on the right is ideal if you're working that soil in the palm of your hand and it gets just a little bit sticky, but it's kind of firm at the same time. That's probably a silt soil there, so a little more ideal. And then finally on the far right, it gets pretty gummy when you add water. It's probably a clay type soil. All right. And finally, the last of the physical characteristics is soil stability. And this is the workability of the soil. And it's influenced by many factors, including moisture and compaction, like we've talked about. Good soil is lots of things. It is well aerated, infiltrated, aggregated, mineralated, and full of living creatures. It is also loose, not compacted, friable, and granulated. So lots of terms there, each with their own kind of dimension for healthy soils. But if you can achieve some of those, you're doing pretty well. If you can achieve all of those, you'll be in great shape. All right, moving on to chemical properties here. Keep in mind, plants need 17 essential nutrients or chemical compounds for growth. The macronutrients listed on your left here, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, etc., on down the list. These are typically required by plants in larger amounts, and they're also found more abundantly in the soil. The macronutrients listed on the right of the chart here include boron, copper chloride, iron, etc. And there are some other nutrients that you might not see on this list, which may be required for certain plants depending on what you're growing. But the general number is 17, and those are listed here. In a typical soil, you can see on this graphic, the mineral particles account for almost half, about 45% of the soil makeup. The remaining 50% is air and water. So another big chunk. And then finally, the last 5% is the organic matter, humus, and root structures, where a lot of the good stuff happens. That's my favorite part. But we also got to talk about the chemical parts too. So the chemical components of soil are continuously cycling through various chemical processes happening simultaneously. And these include many, many things: decomposition of organic matter, reduction and solubilization of sulfate and phosphate compounds, iron oxidation, nutrient absorption by the plant, the breakdown of toxins and pollutants, metal absorption, and nitrogen fixation. So the soil is kind of like the liver of the ecosystem, always channeling and recycling mineral compounds where they need to go. All right, let's talk about the biological properties. These are kind of a little more fun because we're talking about the live components of soil. And this is where those biological processes occur. Most importantly, decomposition. The soil organic matter makes up only 5% of the total soil composition, but contains billions of microscopic microorganisms working to break down plant and animal debris and various stages of decomposition. These microorganisms include bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi, algae, protozoa, and nematodes. These organisms perform very important functions within the soil and are vital to our survival. Decomposition is so important. It releases chemical compounds that provide nourishment for plants. It solidifies soil particles into structural units, also known as aggregates, that can hold water, which are important for soil function, as we learned. And then finally, decomposition is a continuous process. So we always need to be adding fresh organic matter to our soils to stimulate these processes throughout the year. So where do we get organic matter? That's a great question. The best kind comes from the plants themselves, animals too. In fact, organic refers to anything that was once living, like leaf litter, manure, compost, or mulch. These are very beneficial to the soil and provide food for microorganisms as they break down. So hopefully we have gained some knowledge about basic soil science. Let's take a look at some of the practical things that you can do to build your soils. Here are some suggestions. First, you can minimize disturbance to maintain soil stability and protect those aggregates. In other words, reduce tillage unless absolutely necessary. You can maximize underground biodiversity, and this is achieved by planting a variety of plants and is very beneficial to the soil. You can nurture living root systems by feeding the soil and living structures with compost and other amendments. And finally, mulch. Cover the soil with any kind of mulch, some kind of mulch. We'll get into that in just a second. All right, plants will maximize soil diversity as they interact with the soil in a variety of ways. Some plants release nutrients into the soil to feed microbes or other plants. Root systems from symbiotic relationships. They form symbiotic relationships with fungi to improve water and nutrient uptake. As root systems move through the soil, they reduce compaction and form channels for water and air to move. Decomposition of plant debris from season to season adds nutrients to the soil as they decompose. And finally, irrigation not only supports the plant for healthy growth, but supports soil health as well. Here's a resource that I use often, just from day to day, season to season. Folks often call me and say, how much should I be watering? And this is provided by the Albuquerque Water Authority, provides us just a snapshot of the year of some basic water recommendations, depending on what you're growing and what season you're in. And it's important to know that we need to water our landscapes year round. We're in a hot and dry climate, even in Los Alamos. That didn't used to be the case 20 years ago, but today we are definitely seeing the effects of that. As temperatures increase, plants lose more water to transpiration, which means they need more supplemental water. It's recommended to add water about once a month in the winter when we do not have large amounts of snow sitting on top of those soils, and when the ground is not frozen, because when the ground is frozen, that water is going to be tied up in the form of ice. Water can't penetrate through, so just keep that in mind. Also consider using compost and using it frequently. Compost is the result of decomposition of organic materials through biological and chemical processes. It's very rich, full of bacteria and fungi and other nutrients to support plants and soil health. I like to use it in my garden at least once or twice a year. I even spread a thin layer on my lawn each fall and just let it sit under the snow, under the leaves. And by spring, it's gone. It's completely gone. It's broken down and sitting in the soil, which helps my lawn green up come spring. It's pretty easy to compost at home if you're not already. They sell different sizes of bins that are easy to access, rotate, and harvest. Or you can construct your own boxes in the yard. Ideally, you should have 3 of them, one for fresh scraps, a pile for working without new additives, and then a place to hold finished compost. Keep in mind, if you're composting at home, your compost pile needs carbon-rich brown materials such as plant debris, leaf litter, and cardboard, among others. It also needs nitrogen-rich green materials such as vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, and grass clippings. And it also needs air and water. Compost piles can be active all year long, though they're a bit slower in the winter because of the temperature. The EcoStation has free compost if you load it yourself, or they will charge you $20 if you'd like to take a pickup bed full. and they'll load it for you with their machinery. It does contain biosolids. I think we talked about that before. So just be careful about contamination if you have children and pets. And it's not recommended to use that in your vegetable gardens because of the risk of contamination to edibles. It is fine to use in the soil around fruit trees, on lawns, as long as you're not interacting, playing in those spaces. And you can also purchase compost from any local nursery or any big box store. They've got it pretty much anywhere, any of those places. And it comes nicely contained in a bag. So some people prefer to use that instead. Either way, compost is compost. It's all good with the soil. Now moving on to mulch. New Mexico soils need mulch like animals need skin. We are a hot and dry climate, even in Los Alamos. The trend in weather patterns over the last decade shows an average increase of about 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit and an average decrease in precipitation by about 1.7 inches. It's interesting how those numbers aligned. I was surprised I had to do my math a few times. So this means the soil is hotter and drier too. Mulch does lots of good things. It serves as a protective barrier from the intensity of the sun and wind. It also helps us to hold the soil in place by reducing erosion from rain and snow melt. It retains moisture and reduces soil temperature fluctuations across the seasons, and it provides some weed control. Emphasis on here on some. A lot of folks think, well, I'll just pile it on thicker and thicker, and you might slow those weeds down, but eventually they're going to find their way, or new ones will fly in and plant. I shouldn't say fly in, I should say blow in. Okay, when adding mulch to your spaces, you'll want to consider the type. There's basically two kinds. Organic mulch is anything that was once living, like straw, bark, wood chips, newspaper, or expired plants, also called green manure. Nutshells are another option of organic mulch. It does break down over time, so you'll need to replace it each year, but that's also the bonus. As it breaks down, it's releasing nutrients back into the soil, so definitely a good thing. Synthetic mulch is anything non-living, usually manufactured, includes things like rubber, glass, concrete, even think of our sidewalks. Those are all a form of mulch. Plastic and stone, these provide the same protection as organic materials, but without the release of those nutrients back into the soil. So you don't need to replace those as often. A little more expensive initially, but you've got to kind of outweigh your benefits and think about what your plans are as far as aesthetic. And if you're using either an organic or a synthetic, it's recommended to apply at least 4 inches of mulch around your plants and in your beds. So that's a wrap. This was a fun topic, one that I like talking about. I don't think we truly appreciate soils until we try to grow in them, especially here. Los Alamos is unique and often challenging, so give yourself a little time and room to fail. I know I've had my share of that. Let's recap quickly just some of the things that we went over in today's presentation, just to kind of help solidify the concepts. First of all, we talked about some of the soil conditions that you may have in your yard, as well as what to expect based on what's growing. We learned about the beneficial things that healthy soils can do for us and what our responsibility is in the big picture, very key factor. We explored some of the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil and how they work together to create soil health. And finally, we talked about some practical things you can do to improve your soil in your spaces. With that, I hope you will be able to implement some good practices moving forward to help you plant and grow successfully. Here are some tips that I just jotted down quickly for you. First of all, test your soil to learn how to better support your plants. Cover bare soils and landscape with compost, then mulch. This fall and winter, because we're headed into those seasons, now is a good time to do it. Leaf litter makes a great mulch over the winter, and then a great addition to your compost pile in the spring. Set up a compost pile that is manageable for you, or pick some up from the eco station or a local nursery. Water your trees and shrubs once a month, at least, if we're not getting significant snow or rain this fall, winter, and spring. Learn about your existing plants and others you are interested in adding to your landscape. And finally, come to the next sessions. We've got 3 more on the calendar for you guys, all happening at 6 p.m. in White Rock. We move from Los Alamos to White Rock next week, and after that, they'll all be down there. We've got plant selection on October 26th. We've got irrigation on November 2nd and maintenance on November 9th. And with that, I'll take any questions you have. I will just show you briefly, I have a few resources here on the materials that'll be posted online. And we also have a master sheet of references, which is getting quite long. It's now, I think, 3 or 4 pages, but so many resources out there. And these are just the ones from this presentation. All of the presenters have been working to using their references to compile their presentation. So we'll have that available to you guys as well, if not already. I think we posted ours. Did you post? Abby did too. Okay. So with that, I'll answer any questions you may have, ideas, thoughts, concerns. Friable is just it's not stuck together, not compacted. Like you think about the soil test, it's got some elasticity to it. You know, that middle sample that was ideal versus being just cake-like or even gum-like. It's got a little bit of elasticity to it. No, friable is a what is it? A mechanism, a texture, not a texture, but a mechanism. So, some question in the back. Okay. Good question. Let me repeat that for the folks on Zoom. The question is to rake or not to rake. Some folks believe that leaf litter might compact and maybe affect the soils negatively. You know, it's definitely a debatable question. And I think it depends on what you've got going on in your space. And, you know, some of those ash trees that are 60 feet tall, they will dump tons of leaves. And if you don't move those somewhere each year, you're going to end up with 2 feet of leaf litter, you know. Yeah, that too. So I think it depends on what you've got growing and what's going on in your space. A lot of spaces, you know, if you've got something manageable, leave a small layer on, especially, or like what I do is I rake up my tree leaves. I put them in my perennial beds. I put them in the vegetable beds. Just, you know, a reasonable layer, not anything too crazy, but just enough to let them break down with the moisture over the season. So definitely a hard yes or no question kind of question to answer. Yeah. Yep, that works too. Yes, so suggestion was to rake up your leaves, put them in a bag and stomp them or run them through the lawnmower and shred them. Makes it a little more of a fine amendment to that you can spread a little more easily. So good suggestion. Thank you. Question. I've had at least 2 years of all my neighbors' leaves because I got trees and I spread it across 85 so lots of leaves. And of course the vine leaves were really long. So now what do I do? I plant something. When you want to plant something? Okay, question is, let me make sure I got this right. Clay soils and leaves have been donated by the neighbor. So you've got lots of things by the neighbor. are on top of it. Lots of bindweed on top of that. Now what? Okay. Lots of, let me just rephrase that so we're not confused. Lots of leaf litter on top of clay soil, existing clay soils, and weeds mixed in, bindweed in particular. So bindweed, I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole another hour discussion. But that's a good question. So what are you wanting to plant? Flowers, so like perennials, annuals, okay. And is it, for some reason I thought raised bed, but no, it's not a raised bed. Okay. Okay. So what I would recommend is, and you mentioned rototilling. Are you wanting to rototill those in, or what's your thought? I would not rototill it unless, I mean, unless they're compacted and you need to start somewhere. Rototilling is bad because it breaks up that soil aggregate to where the water just slams through. It doesn't hold. And so you could probably just loosen up the top layer just a little bit, maybe with a rake. If you have a small rototiller, that's probably okay, but nothing too crazy. And you kind of have to just learn by experimenting with that too. As you get to know your soils and your spaces, you'll kind of figure out, well, that was too much, or maybe I need to do more, that sort of thing. And so the plants are a good way to determine kind of where your soil is at and what it's doing. I would also maybe test your soils, unless you've already done that. Okay. And they can make some recommendations for you as far as what to add. You certainly want to amend it because, whether it's clay or sand or silt, you're going to want to amend it. And then based on their recommendations, go from there. You don't have to mix it in. It will work its way in. Yep, you just put it right on top, and over time that breaks down. For example, I mentioned I put a thin layer of compost right on my grass. I have a lawn in my backyard, and we put that on, a couple inches thick, rake it all around, and just forget about it. The dog doesn't go on there. The kids are older, and so we just leave it. Let the snow fall, let the leaves fall on it, let it just sit, and then by springtime, it's completely gone to where you wouldn't even know it. And same with the leaf litter. I have to rake up a little bit, but not much. So let that sit, and over time, hopefully we get some moisture over the winter, and that will break down and do good things in the soil. So you could set it right on top, even in the spring. This is one thing I do too. I compost layer on top. And then if I want to put a new plant, dig a hole, put it in, mulch it, water it, and then, watch it, obviously. But yeah, as long as you're staying on top of your watering, as long as it's covered with some mulch, all that's going to break down over time. And as that process starts and you have new amendments coming in, like your mulch breaking down, I say new, but it's existing. So you're getting new nutrients from that mulch. Once that process gets going, then you're starting to build healthy soil. No, you want to leave it just right on top, especially now through the fall. Now is a good time to just put it and leave it and walk away from it and let it do its thing. A lot of folks will put like a layer of newspaper and then put, I don't know, a mulch on top of that, like a wood mulch on top of that, and let it just break down. Make sense? All right, next question. She could, absolutely. Great suggestion. So suggestion was for folks on Zoom, planting a cover crop could help just work those soils a little bit a little bit easier, and also a rake versus a shovel or a hoe or a tiller to help just get some water, maybe just a bit deeper. Great suggestions. Thank you. Next question. I think there was one here in the front. Did you have a question?
I just had a comment. I read an article about, the layering. They called it lasagna, and that's just layering the different materials and it will decompose. Yeah.
The comment was, see if I can put this in terms of lasagna. What goes in front? Lasagna amendments to the soil. So a layer of newspaper, a layer of cardboard, layer of mulch, a layer of rock, whatever you've got, and layer that in, let it decompose, except the rock that won't decompose. Yes, next question or comment.
I see that it's not drained. Is my only option just to be super careful with my watering? And I think I'm one thing is that less frequent and a slower drip.
Let's see, we'll go back to that.
It was way back.
Yeah.
But that's really my only option, to be very careful with my watering. In the intervening years, yeah.
Question is, with clay soils, again, is the only option to be careful with water. You can amend. Amendments are always good, but like you said, those take time, doing all that. Yeah. In the meantime, yes. In the meantime, yes. Yeah.
I have to fix things.
Okay.
That, but I know that's supposedly not so good. Then your roots will just stay in a good spot, right? And not go out.
Not necessarily. Depends on what you're growing. People say that, and it's another arguable thing. So yes and no. Plants are going to go where the resources are, but eventually those are going to go away. Now, if you're adding that's going to spread too. If you're adding amendments to the soil, that it's not just like a little pocket, so to speak. Those are going to spread. Okay.
And so really, there was another one.
See if we can find that slide. That one?
Okay. So I'm sure there are many people that say, you're going to plant when you need to plant, right?
Right.
But you don't have any options.
Water is key, and watering schedule is key, as we showed here. So yes, I think that to answer your question, yes, that's a big one. So I know. Yes. Okay. So a couple inches of compost is very beneficial, and that should go ideally over a space that would span a mature tree. You're going to start with probably something small in the ground, and so you just want to, as that tree grows, those roots are going to spread laterally, and so you want to support that soil in the vicinity. Now, it's impossible to maintain every square inch that the roots are going to go, but you do your best to try to kind of visualize where those roots are and just amend that soil in those areas. Yes, question in the back? Oh, okay, that's a good question. How deep are your beds? Oh, okay, and are those coming up to the surface? Okay, so question is what to do in raised beds about 2 feet deep when aspen roots are creeping in. That's a good question. Let's talk about that. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. Any suggestions in the room? Or it seems destructive to get down deep, but yeah, and then they've come up a long way. Like if you're talking 2 feet, you could maybe dig outside the bed. You could try to locate them outside the bed, those suckers, but that's quite a bit of work too. But let me think on that and get back to you on that.
They come in and see the big plant, like this big small place, and so on the tree, grow it, and then I put them around that tree. And every time the water goes into the hole and doesn't break out, and that filter will be something. So we talked about how to overcome that. So we decided to move the irrigation out from the hole. And that's where the root, where the water goes. So they go out and stuff.
Yeah, you're getting a little farther out from
outside of
that hole.
Thank you.
That's great. We just had a great suggestion here for a tree that was planted in a clay soil with irrigation right in the planting hole, and they moved the irrigation to more lateral location away from the base of the tree, which seems to be better for helping those roots. So thank you for that. Yes. For what? The county? It's generally about 8, give or take. Some folks are 7.8, 7.9, others 8.1, 8.2, but on the average about 8. Pine needles are a great form of mulch. A lot of people don't like them because they think they're acidic and they're going to harm the plants, but we have alkaline soils. That's my argument. So I would say use them. And a lot of other folks say use them too. So definitely worth not throwing those away. And some people don't like the look of them. They can also go in your layers, in your mulch, your lasagna mulch, your mulch lasagna, like we talked about earlier. That's another great thing to add to that. So definitely okay in my book. Sure, absolutely. Pine cones. Yeah, sorry. There was a mention of pine cones, and so we said yes. It is. It is because and that's the argument, right? We're so different than Albuquerque, but we're really not that different if you think about it. They're probably about 10 degrees hotter, and they're in a little different planting zone as we are, just because we have colder nights in the winter. But we are seeing across the county so many problems because plants are not getting enough water, mostly with our natives, our pines, ponderosas, spruce trees. I am visiting probably 10 houses in a 2-week span right now for spruces that are suffering. I've been visiting people about their pines and piñons during It doesn't matter the season. So lots of calls on that. So I tell people they need supplemental water. They need that water. Our climate is no longer supportive of their native habitat. So we have to support them if we want to save them. Yes. So I'm just kind of following the same rule as our deciduous trees, once a month in the winter, and then in the summer, about every other week. If it's super hot and dry, if you want to go once a week, it's really hard to overwater here unless you've got these tough clay soils. But start with once a month and see how things look. A lot of times you'll go 5-6 months on that schedule and you'll start to see some improvement. So just kind of take into consideration what soil type you have, and then watch the plants, watch the trees, and how they do over a period. I think so. It can take a day if you use a soaker hose. Okay, question is, let me rephrase that. So a participant had an arborist come out that recommended once a month watering overnight on a just a slow drip on the hose. And the answer is yes. However, all that water is going to be in one place, so maybe that's not ideal. So it spans. Okay, I'm thinking garden hose, soaker hose. Okay, yes, that is ideal. So you've got multiple points around that drip line, and overnight, gosh, that's going to be what, 8 hours, maybe 10. So that's quite a long time, and it's always, how do you know the volume? If you know the drip rate, you can calculate the volume, etc. So just take that all into consideration. But yeah, you want that water to get down a couple feet, and so you've got to. I don't tell people to water at night. I tell them to water during the day because it's a little more manageable. But to even if they're watering with the hose, to just move that hose 5 or 6 places around the drip line and let it sit for an hour or so. Kind of do it. Set a timer, go do something else, come back to it, move it, that sort of thing. Okay. Every night, that's pretty, huh? Yeah, that's a lot of water. You also got to take into consideration too the resources that we're putting on these native trees that are likely not to survive. Even with our best efforts, it's money, it's water, which is valuable. And so, I tell people just weigh that. You've got to consider what the long-term goal is as far as managing these big mature native trees. So, okay. All right. Do we have more Zoom questions? Okay. How about in the back? Say it again. So the question is, beginning to compost in Los Alamos without attracting predators. And I didn't hear the suggestion that was made. Okay, so let me just relay this to the Zoom folks. The suggestion is to compost in buckets with air holes poked for aeration at the bottom and the lid. And then the lid placed loosely. Another thing you can do is bury your scraps. Just dig a hole and put them right in the ground. A lot of people do that. Okay. Okay, the tumblers are also a great suggestion for keeping predators out. Was there a comment here in the front, sir?
I was gonna say, I compost, I built a wood bin, I lined it with, hardware cloth and a lid. And so, I'll put leaves in there and then add green stuff during the summer, and I've never had raccoons or anything else get into that. But it's, investing in, building these multiple bins so that you start your composting process, but it's lined with hardware cloth and it's got a lid on it, so it keeps the critters out.
Great suggestion. That's building your own boxes with hardware cloth and a lid so that it's secure and to keep those predators out. Thank you. Great question. Great comment. Bokachi composting system is another recommendation for us to research and look into. I have 708. Are there any other content or questions or comments? This is a great discussion. Y'all have been a good group tonight, and it's always fun. I love this topic. I'm always learning, and I love to hear everybody's experiences. So great discussion. Is that all on Zoom? All right, excellent. Well, thank you again.